Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chapter 1, Module 4. So I tried, uploading to Google Slides, and hopefully that helps our formatting issues that we are experiencing in the other modules. Okay, so let's get started. So when we look at the goal of this module is we're going to look at what the lifespan perspective is. So we talked about the kind of historical roots, the philosophical roots, and now we are going to be looking at what the lifespan perspective actually is. So developmental psychology has changed since it first started. So it used to be believed that development stopped at 18. So in the past, developmental psychologists would study conception through the age of 18, and they'd be like, okay, once you hit 18, development stops. So we know that that is not the case. So now developmental psychologists look at the entire lifespan. They also now understand that inborn characteristics interact with environmental factors in complex ways. So it's kind of a fancy way to talk about the nature versus nurture debate. And what we understand now is that those two things interact together. So we know that our genes, so our nature, are going to influence our development, but those genes are also going to interact with our environment to influence how we develop as well. And so the pioneers thought almost in terms exclusively of norms, which like looking at those milestones and things like that, what you expect to see at certain ages. Now developmental view norms as just representing only one kind of change. So it's not the only thing that developmental psychologists are studying. So according to the lifespan perspective, important changes occur during every period of development. So changes must be interpreted in light of culture and the context which they occur. So you can't ignore culture when we're studying developmental changes. So for instance, in our culture, in Western culture, so when we're looking at the culture that we're studying in now, we've seen changes in the sequence of events that happen after we turn 18. So 50 years ago or more, it might have been really common for someone to graduate high school, or maybe not even graduate high school, get married right away and start having children. So for instance, my grandfather's girlfriend, who has now passed away, got married when she was 15. And she said that was just common. So she was 93 when she passed away, but that was common to get married that young. She had been working since she was 11, and she got married extremely young. Now that's almost unheard of in Western culture, whereas in other cultures around the world, it is common for people to get married quite young. So we see changes that happen. So when you're looking at development, you have to make sure you're looking at the context and also the culture that it's happening in. Developmental psychologists look at interdisciplinary research, meaning that they take the use of sociologists, psychologists, doctors, biologists, anthropologists to understand development. And also it looks at the capacity for positive change or plasticity in response to environmental demands is possible throughout the entire life, meaning that we are fluid. So we're going to respond and react to the environment and to the changes that occur throughout our lifespan. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but psychologists view that view adulthood as a period of change for many reasons. So there are many changes that can occur in adulthood. So all of the development doesn't just stop at 18. So after 18, many people go on to postgraduate studies, which has delayed the age of marriage for many people. They get married, they start families, they may potentially get divorced. Some of you might be second career individuals where you're coming back to school and kind of looking to start a new job, things like that. So we know that development continues to happen across the lifespan. And there's been significant increases in life expectancy in the industrialized world. So people are continuing to live longer and longer, which obviously influences our development. So throughout the semester, we're going to be looking at the 3 domains of development. So the 3 domains are physical. So that includes changes that are happening in the size, shape, characteristics of the body. So physical development really there's no period of greater change in physical development than infancy. So when you think of a child, I'll give my son my baby, he's 18 months, kind of like a little rundown of his growth. So he was born 6 pounds 2 ounces. He is 18 months old, and he is now probably close to 21 pounds. So in the first 6 months of life, children are expected to double their size, and they triple their initial weight by a year. So my son grew just like he stayed on his percentile chart very very consistently in the first year. So he was born kind of small in a smaller percentile, and he still is, but he was 6 pounds, and by 12 months he was 18 pounds, which means that he tripled, which is exactly what you would expect to see. So that's what the physical we would look at, physical changes that are happening. The cognitive domain looks at changes that are occurring in our thinking, memory, problem solving, and other intellectual skills. So we know that the cognitive changes that occur, again, we'll use young children as an example. So you think a young child comes into the world, and their only means of communicating is through crying, and then by the time they are 2 years old, they know close to 200 words, and by the time they go to school, they know thousands of words. So those are huge cognitive developmental changes that are happening. And then socially, those include changes in variables associated with relationships to other individuals. So I'll give my older son, Micah, who's 3, an example of this is last night I took him to ride. He was going down the road to ride his bike, and he was so excited because our little neighbor friend was out in the yard, and he went to play with her. And so he's starting to really make friends, and he talks about wanting to play with his cousins, and he wants to play with other young children his age. So he's really starting to socialize with other children and play with other children. So you see huge shifts socially, and you'll see that those changes happen across the lifespan. So young children, when they go to school, their peers become extremely influential in high school and in university age. So in adolescence and early adulthood, often people have really large social circles. And then as they age, their social circles tend to get smaller, but more cohesive. So I think back to myself, even I'll use me as an example. When I was in university, I had a really large friend group who I still love and adore my friends today, but I moved away from them all, and my social circle is a lot smaller. So I have only a few really good friends. And it's right now I'm in a time of my life where I work full time. I have 2 children. I'm married. And so it's really hard for me to maintain a lot of friendships. So I have a smaller group of friends, but I'm really close with them. Okay, so in continuity and discontinuity in development, so we see age-related changes can be classified by 3 different categories. So you see universal changes, meaning that they happen across the world. So you would see physical development as a fairly universal. So the patterns of development that you see in young children tend to be something that you'd see across cultures. Group-specific changes. So retirement would be a group-specific change, meaning that not everybody retires globally. So there's culturally some populations of people will retire and others won't. And then they would also study individual differences. So how an individual develops. So you might see a huge variance in individual development depending on the person that you're studying. So when we look at those kind of in deeper, so a universal change, those are common to every individual in a species and are linked to specific ages. So some changes happen because of genetically programmed maturing process, and others are a social clock. So that's a set of age norms that defines a sequence of normal life experience. So for instance, you could see for a social clock, some people that are in their late 20s, early 30s, potentially they just got married. And a common question, which you should never ask people because you don't know what someone's going through, is when are you having children? So I remember the day that I got married, I hadn't even left the reception hall and people were asking me when we were going to start having children. And then once you have one child, you start getting asked when are you going to have another? And now that I have 2, everyone's I have 2 boys. They ask me are you going to try for a girl? Right? So those are socially norms that you would expect to see. Right? And so sometimes those can vary, but that would be what society kind of deems as like the step, right? So for people that just graduated high school, and you might have gotten a lot of people asking you in the last year, what are you going to do? Like, where are you going to school? What do you want to be? What career, right? Because our social norms would say that once you graduate high school, you go on to post-secondary and then you start a career. Age norms, however, can lead to ageism. So often that's prejudicial or behavior directed towards older adults. So people might assume that an older adult isn't as cognitively able as a younger adult. So they might be treated differently. They might be subject to abuse, things like that. Group-specific changes are changes that are shared by individuals in a particular group growing up together. So culture is going to shape development and our ideas about what normal development is, example, retirement. And then you also would look at cohorts, so describes groups of individuals born within the same few years, and you would see how they how they share like historical experiences at the same time in their lives. So for instance, if say you have a group of students that are graduating high school and moving into college, right now we're kind of in this like historical light. Like we will look back at COVID-19 as a historical event that occurred. And so a cohort would be the same group of people same age, experiencing the same historical event at the same time. So we could assume that COVID-19 is going to have some sort of influence on the cohorts of people that are experiencing it. And then individual changes are a result of unique, unshared events. So a critical period is a specific period in development when an individual is especially sensitive to the presence or absence of some kind of experience. So when we talked about, I gave you in an earlier module, the example of Genie, The Secrets of the Wild Child, they believe that there's a critical period for language development. So young children's brains are wired to acquire language. Young children, if you talk to a baby in 6 languages, they would learn 6 languages because they believe their brain is primed to learn. It's a lot harder as you get older. It's not impossible, but it is harder to learn a second language than a young child. Sensitive period is a span of months or years during which a child may be particularly responsive to specific forms of experiences or particularly influenced by their absence. So you could look at the influence of school on child cognitive development and what would happen if they were absent. And then atypical development is development that deviates from the typical pathway. So say you had a child that wasn't meeting their cognitive milestones or the physical milestones, you would say that they are experiencing atypical development. Okay, so almost done this module. So an interactionist model of development would look at how both nature and nurture are going to work together and create reciprocal relationships and influence development in that way. So there's ideas of vulnerability and resilience. So vulnerability and protective factors that a child is born with will then interact with their environment. So depending on that child, there might be different they might have different vulnerabilities or different protective factors. So studies of Canadian children have shown that a combination of highly vulnerable children and a poor, unsupportive environment will lead to negative outcomes. So say you have a child that is born genetically vulnerable, potentially. So we know that, for instance, intelligence and IQ is a nature and nurture. So we know that your genes will influence your IQ, but so will your environment. So say you have a child that's born particularly vulnerable, and then you put them in a really unsupportive environment, you would expect to see the poorest outcomes. So this is kind of what that chart is showing. So you have a vulnerable child in an unsupportive environment, you would expect to see a poor outcome. A resilient child in an unsupportive environment you would expect to see a better outcome than the vulnerable child. If you put an invulnerable child in a supportive environment, you might see an okay outcome, but potentially not as good as a resilient child in a really supportive environment. So that interactionist model is essentially saying that how your genetics and how you were born is going to interact with your environment to produce a developmental outcome. And that is it for chapter 1. So if you have any questions, make sure you're writing them down and bringing them with you when we do our live sessions together. So thank you.